have to come up with some pretty good specifics to back that up. Because as you say, they are the preeminent body, they are the number one. In a case of the IPCC's word against anyone else's word, the IPCC wins every single time.
That's right.
So for you to come out, I mean, people would be very quick to point out, A, you're not a climatologist.
That's right.
So who are you to criticise climatologists on issues of climate science? People will be very quick to point out that you're essentially a lone ranger, as it were, coming out and throwing rocks at a hornet's nest. Like, what's the game here? So, specifics, please. What have you found specifically that might be able to convince me that the IPCC are not who I, like everyone else, have always been told they are?
One of the things, I'm going to give you specifics in just a second, but I'm just going to preface it by saying that I am not a scientist. Mm-hmm. I have no scientific training whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So I have not equipped to decide which scientist is right. Mm-hmm. So my criticism of the IPCC does not touch their science. Okay? What I am is a journalist, and I am perfectly capable of asking some very basic questions about an organization and whether the organization lives up to its billing, whether the things we have been told about the organization and how it behaves are actually true. You don't need to be a scientist to ask those questions, and every member of the public can understand those questions. So that is, I'm not a person to talk about which scientist or which scientific theory is right or wrong. I totally admit I have no idea. I'm not equipped to make that decision. So, when we're talking about shortcomings, well, we have been told repeatedly that these are the world's top scientists, the best and the brightest, have been selected to write this report. No. Now, we must understand that because the IPCC is 25 years old, and it is now completing its 5th major report, and there have been numerous smaller, shorter reports, there have probably been about 9,000 scientists over the years that have been involved as authors to some degree with the IPCC. Now, some of those scientists have in fact been brilliant, and they have been world-class experts at the top of their field. Okay, so I'm not going to say that every scientist has been a disappointment. But the problem is that there are lots of people who are helping to write the IPCC reports who are not world-class scientists. So one category is graduate students. Now, there's nothing wrong with graduate students helping a world-renowned authority do their research and helping them write up that research. That's not a problem. The problem is that the IPCC is making graduate students lead authors. Or, even worse, coordinating lead authors, which means they're in charge of a chapter. Okay, so we have a number of cases of this. We have a gentleman named Richard Klein, who became a lead author for the IPCC at the tender age of 25. He was years and years and years from finishing his doctorate, but he was a lead author already. We have another gentleman who became a lead author for the IPCC. They're relying on his expertise, his expert judgment, before he'd even finished his master's degree. Yes, so, we're told that these are the best and brightest the world has to offer. No, I'm sorry. I found, and this was very unsystematic, this was just me, checking things out and stumbling across, a few cases which then ended up being, a number of cases, and I've written a chapter about this in my book, where, one of the women who was selected back in 1994, I think, to write the very first health chapter for the IPCC, in which they talked about malaria as being an issue with climate change, and they talked about it in a very amateurish, inaccurate way. Right. But people still, many years later, are still pointing to that and saying, the IPCC says malaria is going to get worse because of climate change. Well, this woman had not even, first of all, she was years from getting her PhD. It would be 16 years later before she completed her PhD. It would be 3 years before she published her first academic paper. She was not an expert in anything.
I'm sorry, she was a lead author?
I think at that point she was a contributing author.
But having not actually written a single piece of academic literature up until that point in time.
It would be 3 years before her first academic paper was published, and yet she was on the team. Her name is on that part of the I.P.C.C. report. So we have very young and inexperienced people. And again, I'm sure there are some very brilliant young people. But, you know, they're surely a rare occurrence in science for someone who has not even completed their doctorate to be, you know, considered a world-class expert. And if those people are those exceptions, the I.P.C.C. really has to make the case. But it hasn't. You know, it has a history since at least the mid-1990s of appointing very young, inexperienced people to be authors of its reports.
So unqualified scientists, obviously that's a fairly serious issue, particularly when you're dealing with a peak body such as the I.P.C.C. But even if they're not qualified yet, if their methods are okay, then their work is probably going to be okay. So are you nitpicking at this point? Are you simply just trying to pick the eyes out of what they've done when the actual results stack up?
Well, you know, it's not nitpicking. If an organization goes around telling you again and again and again, we are the world's top scientists, we are the creme de la creme, we are the best, and then you find out that you have these 20-something graduate students, you have been misled. And it's not just the graduate students. You know, another whole category of very questionable authors are people who have links to activist organizations, green organizations. Now, the I.P.C.C. is sort of like a trial, right? The people who work for the I.P.C.C. are holding a trial, and CO2 is the accused. And at the end of the day, they have to decide whether human-generated CO2 is guilty of causing, you know, possible climate catastrophe. So when you have a trial, everyone is supposed to try very hard to be neutral and objective and dispassionate and even-handed, and to look like they're being neutral, not just being neutral. And what's happening with the I.P.C.C. is we have all kinds of green activists who are being chosen to be lead authors and to lead chapters. They have an agenda. Okay? A green organization raises money by scaring people. You know, so anyone who has worked for 20 years for Greenpeace is not an objective scientist. They cannot be part of the jury that decides whether CO2 is guilty, because their organization has already made up its mind.
So you're saying that there are lead authors who have contributed to the what do you call them, the assessment reports?
Yes.
Who have been card-carrying members of
employees of green groups. So, for example, Bill Hare is a very well-known Greenpeace activist. You can find remarks on Greenpeace websites that say he's a legend in the Greenpeace organization. Well, Bill Hare has been involved with the I.P.C.C. for a long time. And last time they put out their assessment report in 2007, he was one of only 40 people who was part of the core writing team for the summary of summaries. Okay, so it's not just out on the margins. You find a Greenpeace person here and there. This man is part of the core writing team. Okay, you look into the heart of the I.P.C.C. and you find a Greenpeace employee, a legend in Greenpeace. So there are a number of other Greenpeace people, affiliations that are a problem. One of the other people involved with the I.P.C.C. for a long time is Richard Moss. He's an American. Now, for a while he was working with the I.P.C.C., he was also a vice president of the World Wildlife Fund. Now, those are the people that bring us Earth Hour. You know, their main concern these days is climate change. So at the same time that he's supposed to be this neutral guy on the jury deciding whether CO2 is guilty or not, he's taking a paycheck from the World Wildlife Fund. Another person with the World Wildlife Fund with those kinds of connections is a woman named Jennifer Morgan. Now, she has spent her entire career working for activist organizations. I'm sure she's a very pleasant person, but she is by no stretch of the imagination one of the world's top scientists. In fact, one of her previous jobs was as the chief spokesperson on climate change for the World Wildlife Fund. And now she is helping prepare the report that is about to come out this September. So how could this be? How could this be? And in fact, when I started looking carefully at World Wildlife Fund links, around 2004, which was when the last report was just getting underway, the World Wildlife Fund did something very curious. They deliberately went out and recruited climate scientists. And then they bragged that they had recruited 130 scientists, mostly but not exclusively from the I.P.C.C, to sit on a World Wildlife Fund panel. So at the very time when these scientists are supposed to be this dispassionate, neutral jury deciding some very important questions that the whole world is waiting for the answer, they're partying with the WWF. They're hanging out with the WWF. So when I started noticing that and looking at the names, my calculations by the end of it was that 2/3 of the chapters in the last I.P.C.C report, out of 44 chapters, 2/3 of those chapters had at least one person and up to 8 people with links to the WWF.
Wow.
And 1/3 of the chapters was actually led by a person with WWF connections. Usually a chapter has 2 leaders, and so 1/3 of the chapters had at least one person, and in one case there were both of the leaders had WWF connections. So, you know, if you're conducting a trial, you have to look like you're neutral, and the I.P.C.C is not a grown-up. It's not a professional organization. It's not playing, you know, at a world-class level. It's, you know, come on. You want me to take your opinion seriously, and you've got all of these people with these very strong activist connections? How can I trust your judgment? This is basic stuff.
Well, a lot of people would argue, though, that the science is settled, that it's not really a problem that there are activists within the I.P.C.C because they're activists agitating in favour of a question that's already been answered. If we already know that CO2 is the culprit, and if the science really is settled, then surely we're going to have people who believe that CO2 is the culprit working for organisations because that's settled.
Well, except you have to pay attention to the actual things that the I.P.C.C says. So the I.P.C.C wrote 4 major reports, and when the last one came out in 2007, what they said was that it is our opinion that there has been unequivocal warming over the last couple hundred years. Well, we all know that because 1850 was the end of the Little Ice Age. So big surprise, people, that it has been gradually warming since 1850. So the warming is unequivocal, and in our opinion, most of the warming in the last 50 years is very likely to have been caused by humans. Our opinion, most of the warming, they can't tell you how much, and then they can't tell you with certainty. They're just, our opinion is that it's very likely. That doesn't sound like settled science to me. That sounds like the experts are giving us their opinion. And experts have a long history of being wrong. So, you know, what the people who write the I.P.C.C report are doing is exactly that. They are giving us their opinion of what the data tells us. And so it's very important that the people who are providing that opinion be neutral and look like they're neutral.
In order to keep and maintain public trust.
Exactly, exactly.